Thanks.
Okay, let's bring in some more current members of the Parliament with our Thursday political panel. Joining us from Perth, the Labor member for Fremantle, Josh Wilson, and from Adelaide, the Liberals MP for Sturt, James Stephens. Welcome back to both of you. And James, why don't I start with you? You were around in the previous Parliament. You're watching and listening to, a lot of explanation. Coming today from Scott Morrison, is it easy to defend as a Liberal? Because you might be asked to. Is it easy to defend his conduct?
Look, I was very surprised to hear the revelations, and of course I wasn't aware until this week of them, and it's regrettable and disappointing that even some of the ministers who it turns out were co-ministers with the former Prime Minister only found out in the last few days as well. I didn't realise, and I accept the explanations of the Prime Minister around advice he received allowing him to do what he did, but I certainly didn't realise until this week that that was something that could be countenanced, and I do have very serious concerns with the principle, and I'm very anxious to see what we can do to clean this up, and I don't want to see something like this happen again in the future. I don't think it is right that these things can occur without being made aware to the public, let alone, of course, people that are directly affected, ministers and heads of department, people that have very important responsibilities under legislation when they're commissioned as ministers. So I'm very anxious to see that we do what is necessary to make sure this can't happen again in the future.
Well, very anxious, you say, James. Just to follow up with you, though, one of your colleagues in Karen Andrews is so aggrieved, or someone might say so principled, as to go further and demand that the member for Cook now leave this Parliament. Would you endorse that?
No, I don't think Scott Morrison, as the duly elected member for the seat of Cook, that he should be resigning from the Parliament. I don't see a correlation between him serving as the member for Cook and this matter, but I understand why Karen Andrews is aggrieved, to use your language, at what occurred. And whilst I have listened to Scott Morrison's explanation, I do think it's quite reasonable that Karen and other people who held ministries that it now turns out he was also holding the same portfolios without their knowledge are aggrieved, and I don't think it's something that's appropriate, and we need to make sure it can't happen in the future.
All right, Josh Wilson, where do you want to see this go?
Well, we need strong acknowledgement that what happened was wrong, unconscionable and dangerous. It needs to be expressed, I think, a bit more strongly than just saying that it makes people disappointed or anxious. The way that these things won't happen in the future is by drawing a really strong line under them now. It was an undemocratic, unprincipled power grab. And I think one of the things that's really disappointing is to hear the former Prime Minister, the member for Cook, trying to say today that it was all because of the circumstances of the crisis. In fact, in a crisis is when you need your democratic processes and institutions to stand up, and you need to respect and cherish them so that they can perform the function that they should have. We should live up to our values into a crisis, not run them into the dirt. And yet that's actually what happened. And it did fit a pattern of behaviour under the previous government, secret spreadsheets in relation to sports rorts, secret donations in relation to Christian Porter, the absolutely disgraceful election day vote text, and none of those things have been disavowed. There's been no responsibility for any of those things. What we've learned about the Prime Minister's, the former Prime Minister's anti-democratic power grab fits into that pattern of behaviour. And the first thing we need to do, if we're going to ensure that doesn't happen again, is see responsibility taken for it by the member for Cook, but also by all the members of the coalition who are part of that government.
And what does that look like, Josh Wilson? I know there are a few options available, but your caucus may well be considering, let's say, some form of parliamentary censure motion. Would you personally support that?
Well, I think those things will unfold in the fullness of time when we get back to Parliament. Obviously, there's an inquiry that the Prime Minister has rightly put in place. We want to see the outcome of that But really, what we need to see is recognition from the member for Cook, but from his colleagues, from the current leader of the opposition, that what happened was unconscionable, dangerous and wrong, rather than, as some members of the coalition have done, seek to excuse what happened, seek to diminish the significance of it, seek to say that it's in the past and nothing to see here and let's move on. Yeah. It really was an unprecedented thing, as people have been saying in analysis of the incident. We'd never seen anything like this in wartime previously.
Yeah, the Prime Minister made the point.
It was really quite outrageous.
Sure, the Prime Minister made the point, James, the current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, that this was unprecedented in 121 years of democracy. He then extended it and said, you know, this is a time when democracies need to be ultra-vigilant about their fragility. Do you think there is structural damage done to our, you know, what we previously thought was a robust Australian democracy because of those very developments?
No, I don't. Look, there have been other examples. Of the Whitlam era is probably a good one, where you know, some claimed contemporaneously that certain things that ministers in that government were doing were similarly rocking us or shaking us to the core. Cairns and Rex Connor in particular, but I think we've got one of the most robust democracies in the world. I think that's why it's important to defend the fundamentals of our Westminster system and cabinet government, which is why I've made the comments of criticism earlier regarding this situation. And I think it's an opportunity to improve our processes. Like I say, I did not have any awareness that what occurred could occur until the revelations of the last few days. I see it as an opportunity to put in place changes to ensure that can't happen again in the future. Certainly, you know, the gazettal of these things would make a lot of sense to be considered. I respect that there are some ongoing advice to be brought forward from the Solicitor General and others, but I'm very confident there'll be some changes recommended. I see that as a good opportunity to enhance and improve our democracy and learn from something that I'm not condoning, and I agree is something that we don't want to see happening again in the future.
Yeah, Josh Wilson, the argument that Scott Morrison put today is that there was this public expectation that he was, for want of a better description, the minister responsible for everything. He wasn't just the Prime Minister of the day. Do you accept any element of that argument? Because throughout the pandemic, all roads seemed to lead to Canberra, even in a situation where our federation was playing things out in real time in an ad hoc fashion. The confusion about what was state and what was federal responsibility seemed to be exposed almost daily. Do you accept any of that argument that he, more than most Prime Ministers, was in a difficult bind here?
No, and who would accept that? I mean, what's the excuse for dishonesty? What's the excuse for pulling the wool over the eyes of the Australian people, aggregating to yourself this extraordinary power in 5 different areas, including health, home affairs and treasury, without coming clean with the Australian people? There's just no excuse for it. And some of the conversation about what we need to do in future, and there's a limit to how you can use rules to stop people from being dishonest, from stop people from seeking to grab power when nobody's looking. And it's odd to find the Prime Minister claiming that everyone thought he was responsible for so many things, when the man himself spent a fair bit of time telling us all the things that he wasn't responsible for. So I think the fact that there's excuse-making going on by Scott Morrison himself and some in the coalition, not everyone, James is not making those excuses, I acknowledge that, but there are people who are trying to find reasons to say that this is not significant, and that's the problem. The one way we make sure it doesn't happen again is by recognising the seriousness of it and calling it out for what it was.
Yeah, and James, this call for collective responsibility, which Josh and others on the Labor side are making, kind of makes sense, but from a Liberal point of view, how does it sit with you when so many of you were kept in the dark in the first place? I suppose the question is, do you and can you take responsibility for things you didn't know about?
Well, exactly. I mean, I wasn't aware, as I've said, until this week. I'm not comfortable with it as a practice, and I think we need to make changes so that it can't happen again. Look, Scott Morrison has given a fairly exhaustive press conference today on this matter. It's up to the people of Australia to judge his explanation for what he did and why. He made some important points in that press conference, and I think people can individually reflect on the motivations he had and the reasons and the justification he's put forward. Like I say, I just wasn't aware until the last few days that what occurred in the swearing in of the Prime Minister into those portfolios without it being public and without the relevant ministers who held those portfolios in some cases being made aware. I just had no idea that that could occur. And I think that's an important change that we can take out of this so it doesn't happen again. I can understand why then Prime Minister Morrison, the points he's made about needing to have contingencies around decision making, etc. I do not understand why it was the case that it wasn't appropriate to inform ministers or for that to be made public, and that's something that clearly needs to change.
Yeah, well, you're not the only one scratching your head. Of that we can be certain, James Stephens. Josh Wilson's probably in the same boat, along with so many in our nation at the moment. But we'll talk about this when Parliament resumes, and we might see both of you back here then. Josh Wilson, James Stephens, thanks for joining us today.